Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's On the Agenda webinar brought to you by the European Liberal Forum. My name is Lauren Mason, and this week we're going to be talking about different technological solutions to overcoming environmental challenges, particularly in the mobility sector. Now, you might have heard today is the first day of the European Mobility Week, so it's perfect timing and good moment for us to have a look at these questions, also because they dovetail in with some of the recent legislative proposals that we've seen with Fit for 55. So we're joined today by three excellent speakers and our moderator, Beatriz Rios. So without any further ado, I will hand over the floor, Beatriz, to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And welcome everyone to this debate today. Indeed, as Lauren mentioned, the question of mobility and transport is one of the main aspects of the Fit for 55 strategy, but overall of the strategy of the European Union to try to achieve that target of becoming climate neutral by 2050. But if we want to achieve that target, there is a lot of changes that we need to be doing in all the transport sector, from road to railway to air. And we are going to be discussing that today. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers with different expertise that are going to bring together all these ideas about all the changes that we need to be doing over the coming years if we want to indeed attain those goals. I don't want to take more of your time, but I want to explain to you how does it work this session in case this is the first time you're joining. First of all, we're going to have over three speakers giving an introductory statement about their own position in this topic. And then we're going to have an open conversation, and we want you to be part of it. If there is anything you'd like to ask our speakers, some ideas you would like to share, please go and check on our chat and share them with us so that we can have a chat together about this relevant issue for EU policy. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker today. She's Geneviève Pons. She's the Director General and Vice President of the European Jacques Delors Institute. So please, Geneviève, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and very glad to be with you today for speaking about this very important challenge for the ecological transformation of the European Union. You probably know that transport is the only sector in the EU where greenhouse gases emissions are still growing. And this is a tendency that can be measured. So we were at 14% of greenhouse gas emissions for the transport sector in 1990, and we are almost at 25% now. So this is a tendency that has to be reversed if we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. I will make 3 points. First point, as you can already guess, is a need for a radical change. Second point is, well, leading to a question, are we able to do so? Are we able to be carbon neutral by 2050? So second point, identify the traps on the road. And third point, the reasons to be optimistic. So first of all, a huge challenge. This is the sector where CO2 emissions especially have been growing in the last years. And you may know that before taking the lead of Europe Jacques Delors, the third Institut Jacques Delors in Europe, I was heading WWF European office. I was really struck by the fact that in the last years, the European emissions have stopped declining because of the rise in the transport sector. So this is a real source of worries, and we have to be very radical in addressing this situation. This is the position that the Commission has adopted in the strategy for smart mobility that has been adopted in December last year. The objective is to reduce the emissions in this sector by 90% by 2050. And there are milestones which are very ambitious: at least 30 million zero-emission cars on the road by 2030, and 100 climate-neutral cities by the same date. To be successful, these changes will have to combine three approaches. First of all, change the fleet, for instance, from combustion to electric vehicles. Change the modes, for instance, as far as freight is concerned, from road transport to rail and waterborne transport. And finally, internalize external cost, which means mainly through pricing. So will we be able to get there? There are traps on the road, and I want to share three of them with you, which are the fruit of my long experience in this domain. I started in this domain more than 30 years ago. I was with Jacques Delors in his cabinet in charge of environment, and I was with him in Rio in 1992. Some of you were not born, I think. But so I've seen a lot. And I will try to condensate this experience in 3 points. First of all, difficulties to change the price signals. When I was in Jacques Delors' cabinet, I chaired 14 head of cabinet special meetings to try to get to a CO2 taxation before Rio. And we succeeded in the commission. We got it. We got it almost by unanimity. But we never got it in the council, never, because of unanimity. So you have to be conscious of that. In the European Union, it is still true now. If you want to change taxation rules, you have to get unanimity. And this is most of the time, I don't know, maybe we will have good surprises, but to my knowledge, it has always been out of reach. So this is the first obstacle. In the Fit for 55 package, there is a very important and not sufficiently commented measure, which is the change in the taxation, energy taxation directive. Until now, this taxation directive, energy taxation directive, is favoring fossil fuels against renewables. If we want to change it, we need unanimity. I hope we will get it, but you know, we cannot be very optimistic on that. But second obstacle to the price signals, changing the price signals, is social reluctance. When you touch to the cost of heating or the cost of driving, which is the purpose of the famous ETS2, which is in the Fit for 55 package. When you touch to this, you touch to the budget of the most modest people in Europe, because it is a higher share of their budget in a relative manner compared to the share of upper class. So you are touching the most modest part of the population in a stronger way. So this is extremely sensitive, as the Gilets jaunes crisis has shown in France. And you have seen that inside the Fit for 55 package, this measure, the ETS2, has been already the most controversial, despite the proposal of a social fund that would be put in place beforehand. So this is an extremely difficult step to be succeeded. The price signal in this domain is delicate. Second problem, scarcity of charging points. For many consumers, drivers, this is the main obstacle in taking the decision to buy an electric vehicle, and especially a fully electric vehicle. If you are not sure that you will find charging points on your way, you will not buy it. I have an example of what happened in Corsica this year. One of the leading business in renting cars had bought 15 electric vehicles. But the people who lent this vehicle in Corsica came back to get a combustion vehicle because there were no charging points. And they were waiting 4 hours at the only charging points of the island. So you see, this is a very important point. And I am a bit more optimistic than a few months before, because I see that many countries have chosen to have this financed by the recovery fund. So we are maybe on track for that. So the main obstacle can be left because there are, beside that, there are a good prospect, especially the cost of batteries are falling faster than expected, and promising investments are made in fast chargers. The last doubt in my trilogy of doubt is about fossil fuels, about, so-called biofuels. This is more relevant for airplanes and for shipping, but still we have to be conscious that what we have called biofuels in Europe a few years ago was actually more nocive than fossil fuels. If you look at the total CO2 emissions of such biofuels, so we have to be very vigilant on this notion of so-called biofuels, and probably a choice in favor of renewable hydrogen will be a smarter one. There are, however, 4 reasons to be optimistic. First of all, there is a rise of a new consumption culture, especially for young urban people. It is much less important to own a car than to use a car. So this is a culture that can give us some optimism. Second, cities are confronted with scarcity of resources, not only cities, but also consumers. You see, for the time being, without any public intervention, energy prices rising. They are rising because the demand is strong, and so you have the normal play of the market. Prices are growing. And this is something that is probably to last. So we know that the price of raw materials, including fossil fuels, are prone to augment. And so this is a reason also to be optimistic, because this will be an incentive to shift to other technologies. Third point, digitalization process and continuous connectivity. This young generation does not dream as much as before as moving, because they know they can be connected through social networks. So this kind of connectivity is rising very fast, and the pandemic has, of course, helped this evolution. And there is now a culture of work anywhere, anytime, including while traveling. This should reduce the demand for mobility. Finally, demographic trends. Already 70% of European population is urban. In the world, as well as in Europe, this tendency to the growing of urban population will continue, and will accelerate. So cities are already confronted to so important problems of pollution and congestion that they have to take drastic measures to shift from traditional transport to new forms of transport. I've been traveling in China a bit before the start of the pandemic, and I've seen in a spectacular manner how big cities in China are now fully electric. So you do not hear a noise, you do not smell fossil fuel perfume, if I may say so, in these cities. You have full electric transport. Then we should not forget an important question: how is this electricity produced? In China, cities are fully electric. However, electricity is still produced mainly through coal. So we should not forget this other face of the medal. A shift in transport mobility has also to take into account a more global shift in the way our energy is produced. I stop here, and I am curious to hear to my young colleagues today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Genevieve, for that. I think you set up a little bit the whole scenario we're talking about today with all the different aspects that we will be discussing. I think it was very important that you touch upon the social challenges, which I think it's one of the main issues that we have been confronted with during the discussion about how to make transport more sustainable. But obviously as well, this question about the energy taxation debate that we're going to see in the coming months in the EU. And this particularly has brought a lot of criticism from some areas of the transport community, saying, well, the EU could have chosen a different approach and go for a change in the energy directive and not necessarily on the taxation side, to make sure that they wouldn't need this unanimity. And also these questions that you mentioned about all the potential changes that might bring the fact that we have more young people who are way more concerned about these issues and are willing to make a change. So let's see where do we go from here. Now I'm going to give the floor to the next speaker, Mathieu Campion, who is the Senior Manager on Central Operations of Uber's Europe, Middle East and Africa headquarters. Please tell us a little bit more about what the perspective of Uber is on this discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beatrice. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having me today. I'm indeed very excited to explain, let's say, the angle of the ride-hailing industry and more specifically how Uber can help make urban mobility a little bit more sustainable. So to somehow echo Genevieve's introduction, I think we start from the same point. The transport sector today is responsible for about 30% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. And about 3/4 of these emissions come from road traffic. And I think we all agree on this call that the consequences on public health and urban quality of life are just massive and undeniable. And this situation is due for us mostly to an over-reliance on fossil fuel-powered personal car use. If you look at it, EVs, which make up the vast majority of zero-emissions vehicles available today, currently only account for 0.5% of the global vehicle fleet. So we've noticed that there's a growing number of research that shows that a broad uptake of shared, electric, and automated technology by 2050 has the potential to cut transportation emissions by more than 80%, vastly shrink the vehicle population, and dramatically reduce reliance on private car ownership, which are all goals that Uber very much subscribes to. So we believe that in the short to medium term, transitioning to electric mobility appears to be the most effective way, the most efficient way to curb greenhouse gas emissions. It is in this context that we launched our global sustainability commitment. This is an effort that was led out of Europe, which is a bit exceptional for a West Coast Silicon Valley company. This report, basically it was headlined Spark Report, and it was written in collaboration with famous NGO Transport and Environment. And in this report, we committed to reaching 50% EV kilometers average across 7 key European capitals by 2025. And later on, we pledge to become a 100% emissions-free platform, ride-hailing platform in Europe and North America by 2030. On the back of those commitments, we've also committed to publicly report on CO2 emissions progress and to expand the availability of our more sustainable options, namely Uber Green, giving more sustainable rides to riders, our transit option, and micromobility options in our app. These are very ambitious targets that would position Uber well ahead the general market in the transition to EVs, where effectively, I like to tell the team, we are trying to accelerate an ineluctable future. So drivers are, of course, absolute central to this objective, and they are key for us to achieve our targets. And as much as we would like all drivers on the platform to switch to a BEV today, we can only expect them to do so when switching to an electric vehicle is in their best interest from an economic point of view. Concretely, it means that we need to make switching to an EV an economically rational decision for drivers on the platform. In most European countries, this change of technology, going from internal combustion engine to a battery electric vehicle, induces increased vehicle acquisition costs. We all know that EVs today and for the foreseeable future will remain more expensive than their ICE for internal combustion engine counterparts, and that will be the situation for some time. Additionally, in the case of the ride-hail industry, the time spent looking for a charger and effectively charging represents an additional opportunity cost for the driver, because during that time, he cannot take additional rides. Therefore, reducing these costs to accelerate EV adoption has been front and center of our strategy and of our approach. And this has taken a variety of forms so far. So of course, it starts with providing better access to the actual vehicle. So to do that, we've negotiated a number of discounts with our partners, the likes of Renault, Nissan, Kia, Hyundai, so all very big players in the electric vehicle field, and we're passing on those discounts onto the platform drivers. We're also developing a dedicated ride-hailing vehicle in partnership with Arrival, a UK-based startup. On the charging front, we've also negotiated a number of preferential rates for charging with companies like PowerDot, BP, EDF. We also pledged to commit £5 million to help the London boroughs accelerate the installation of overnight on-street charge points, especially in less affluent parts of the city, which is typically where drivers tend to reside, and which is also typically the places where the EV infrastructure tends to lag. Of course, most of ride-hailing drivers do finance their vehicle. Therefore, it was also important that we negotiate a number of financing deals with companies like Crédit Agricole or RCI Bank, which is the financing arm of the Renault-Nissan group. But we've also tried to tilt the playing field in a more fundamental way. So we've established certain schemes. In London, it's called the Clean Air Plan. There's an equivalent one in Paris called the Electric Mobility Plan, where basically we charge a small surcharge to the riders on a kilometer basis. For example, in Paris, that's about 3 cents per kilometer. Uber actually doubles up that money. And this money basically fills a fund that is to be used by the driver in order to switch to an electric vehicle. To give you a sense of scale, the London plan so far has raised 125 billion British pounds. Overall, and that's a global number, Uber has committed to making over $800 million available to drivers to fund this transition. With this work, those investments, those partnerships, we believe we are making a strong difference in helping tip the economics in favor of BEVs for drivers. However, as impressive as this list might sound to some, we are completely convinced that there is no way we can achieve those goals alone. And this is why we advocate for a more sectoral approach. And we want to make it clear that we need the entire ecosystem that includes cities, ride-hailing companies, car makers, charging providers, basically everybody on this value chain to work together and to tackle the key barriers that currently prevents drivers from electrifying. Our CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, likes to say that sustainability is a team sport. I like to add to that sentence that I think it's a team endurance sport, because we're only at the beginning of this transition, and I think it will take a lot of time from all players, public and private, civil society, companies, etc., to work together and to drive this electrification forward. And as a sort of parting thought and to open up maybe the discussion, I think it is important for us to acknowledge why companies like Uber need to be so bold in their actions. Our sector can be basically called, we're basically part of the urban fleet sector. And we operate in the high mileage segment of the transportation industry. And that means we can act as a catalyst for the rest of society. Specifically, ride-hail drivers drive on average 4 times the distance of an average European private person, which means that the amount of CO2 we displace every time a driver switches to an EV can have an outsized effect on overall CO2 reduction for the entire city. Additionally, something I hinted at a little bit earlier, fulfilling the driver's charging needs in terms of quantity, but also location, can effectively accelerate the deployment of a solid charging infrastructure, especially in places where it is the most needed and where currently it is the most lagging. A lot has been achieved already by this ecosystem, and I'm proud to be a European in this context because I think it's probably the continent where electrification, and to Genevieve's point, China is also a great example, but let's say it's a bit of a different challenge. But I'm very proud of being a European in this field because I think we are effectively leading the world in our efforts towards electrification. And that's the result of a healthy mix of strong public policies conducive to electrification, a lot of incentives have been spent by the European governments, but also a very proactive private sector all across the EV value chain. I remain very bullish. A lot remains to be done, but I remain very bullish on our sort of chances to achieve those commitments. And no matter what, we're committed to remaining transparent in our progress towards a zero emission platform. So watch this space and stay tuned. And thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's always very interesting to hear the perspective of a private sector, right? To understand a little bit, not only what is being done at the level of the decision-making process, but also how the different companies all across Europe and the world in this case are taking on those challenges. And I found particularly interesting when you mentioned now about European Union leading the way in electrification, because one of the things that we might be discussing afterwards, and I will ask you for sure, it's about how does it actually impacting your strategy somewhere else. Like if you have to adapt to what's going on in Europe, to all the targets that the European Commission is pushing to, are you going to make sure that those same strategies replicate in other countries, or what kind of challenges do you face when those countries might not be as advanced in the electrification process as the European Union is? So I see a lot of challenges coming up in that area, and also the question of the fact that there might be people who decide not having a car because they can always use a service like Uber and taxi, wherever, that reduce in a way the use of cars across the EU. But I think Tom has a different perspective on this question and the importance of public transport in this. So I'm going to give the floor straight to him. Tom Budho is the EU Public Affairs Manager at Flix Mobility. So please, Tom, I want to really hear from you on this one.
Thank you, Beatrice, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I think we fully agree on this panel that we have to drastically change transport, and we have to drastically change how we travel if we want to reduce the emission, and we all agree that we have to reduce emissions drastically and radically to achieve the climate targets. From our perspective, what is absolutely crucial, especially on a long distance, is that it won't help to simply switch out all combustion engine cars for hydrogen or battery electric cars and let people continue traveling in individual cars throughout Europe. Because the only way how we can meet the sustainability targets, at the same time reduce congestion, and with that solving the current issues that we see all across Europe, is to convince people to use collective transport and not to use the individual cars. But to change people's behavior, it is not sufficient and it is not good to control the choice, because this would not address the root cause why passengers actually choose private cars or individual mobility or more polluting forms of transport. It's either more affordable or it's more convenient. We have an example from Germany where the growth in passenger numbers since 2013, since the opening of the long distance bus market, clearly shows that more people are traveling in collective transport with buses and trains, since it is possible to use new forms of mobility and to use a more attractive and a more affordable possibility to travel from A to B. So in order to convince people to use collective transport and not individual, we need to provide them an attractive alternative. We need more green, convenient, and sustainable services that are also affordable and bringing people from where they are to where they want. We at Flix, we are ready to deliver. Before the pandemic, so 2019, we were transporting 60 million people from A to B year by year, with more than 5,000 buses and trains on more than 450,000 connections every day. The discussion that needs to take place right now is therefore how we can invest in proper frameworks to allow companies and to allow the public to choose the affordable and sustainable services that they want and need to get from A to B in an affordable and still sustainable manner. The EU and its member states need to set fair conditions for innovative, efficient, affordable, and sustainable services, so people can in the end make the choice on their own. On the bus and rail market where we operate, this means not to pump billions of euros into subsidized services, but rather to allow fair and equal access so that innovative and technology-driven companies can win over people with an attractive offer. The biggest barrier that is existing today in Europe is actually not lack of subsidies or support. It is rather, on the rail side, the high infrastructure fees that private operators and all other operators have to pay. As an example from our world, in Sweden, we have been recently, this year, a few months back, been able to launch our Flix train services because of the fair market conditions. And interestingly, we were able to launch this route at the same time Ryanair launched a domestic route on the exact same city pair as well. And we feel and see from the first months already that our train service is very much capable of competing with air services, because people, if they have an attractive choice that is sustainable, but at the same time affordable and convenient, they will make the choice to travel the sustainable and convenient way. We would have liked to do similar things in France, for example, the Flix train, but couldn't, because the track access charges there in France are actually so high that one could think that the champagne and caviar is included in the price for all our passengers and our staff as well. On the other hand, on the bus side, we see that some countries actually prevent people from using existing services. So for instance, let's take a person that wants to travel by bus from Barcelona to Lisbon. There are existing services. The person can book a ticket, jump on the bus and go from Barcelona to Lisbon. If the same person wants to book a ticket from Barcelona to Madrid, though, even though our buses are stopping there on the way to Lisbon, they cannot. So there are existing services and the buses are running, but people cannot use them. People cannot travel on them. So what does this all tell us? Competition, more efficient rules and companies, smart distributors, and favorable infrastructure costs make sustainable mobility possible without having to ban private cars or other forms of mobility, but more by designing a market that allows for more attractive and affordable choices. We on our side, we are ready to invest into new services and innovations, such as, for example, electric buses, which we trialed already in 2018, or fully carbon neutral and affordable train services, as we have them in Germany and Sweden. And we rely at the same time on policymakers to go this way together with us, to build together with us the mobility of the future. So many thanks, and looking forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Tom. You actually get me the idea to get back to the question that was put in there before about this issue of, well, you mentioned the question of competition, right? So I was wondering to what extent private companies have been trying to evolve themselves into becoming more sustainable, because that was a need from the consumers that were claiming that they wanted to have more sustainable options, or if it's coming from the push on the institutional side, on the EU side, on the member state side, pushing those companies to become more sustainable if they want to, in the long term, if they wanted to make sense economically in the long term. So I was wondering, how do you see this perspective? Is it actually the private companies that are pushing to get there? Didn't make sense economically before, or is this something that you have been motivated by the changes in the legislation that are coming? And I want to ask the same questions to Mathieu a little bit later.
Sure. So thanks for the question. Actually, it's very interesting because we already started, as said, in 2018 with electric buses, and it was actually us pushing for something that was not available anywhere. We said, okay, our buses, for example, in Germany are already the most sustainable means of long-distance transport, but we want to get further. We want to reduce the emissions to zero. And so we started looking for possibilities how we can get there. At that moment, we went to all European manufacturers and asked them, is it possible to get a long distance bus that is electric? And 99% of our current fleet is manufactured by European manufacturers. And all European manufacturers told us, no, come back in maybe 5 to 10 years and we have something. So the only alternative we were contacted by 2 Chinese companies that said, actually, we can provide you that bus. So we said, okay, well, at some point, European manufacturers have to understand that there is technology and that they have to move. So we trialed those 2 electric buses. In the end, we had to see that the quality and reliability is simply not up to the level we and our customers expect. So we had to end the trial after 1 year, but that didn't stop us. So we, for example, launched the world first biogas bus lines between Brussels and Amsterdam and between Stockholm and Oslo this year. And we're also looking into the development together with other SMEs of hydrogen buses, because also there, the industry, the manufacturing industry is not ready to provide the product. So we ourselves have to move. So this is one part of it. The other part of it is the lack of charging infrastructure, which is, again, a part where we as the industry have to push actually for the public support, because with our electric buses, for instance, there was no charging infrastructure available for buses, for electric buses. So there we had to take care of it ourselves. So on our side, we actually believe that we should be more ambitious and we should have more progress sooner. We see that our customers are waiting for it and they are ready to adapt to new technologies. But we also see that we have to move on, for example, having the vehicles ready, on having the infrastructure ready, because without that, it is impossible to move. We can only do so much, let's say.
There is a need indeed for the European industry to adapt to this demand as well. And obviously, as you mentioned, the question of the public investment in charging infrastructure, which is one of the main objectives of this Fit for 55 strategy that we saw put together by the European Commission in July. Mathieu, what is your experience from Uber? Do you think that that push for a more sustainable mobility is coming from your own view that that's what consumers want, or do you think it's important, the push that you have seen from the European Commission in this sense? And also, as I was saying before, to what extent that's actually influencing, considering that you're not only in charge of Europe, considering that, do you think it's influencing the way Uber conduct its business in other parts of the world, or they're indeed faced with more challenges about these questions that we've been discussing in terms of charging points, in terms of the public infrastructure, and so on?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for it. It's really a key question. So let me start off by saying that I believe that, speaking from the private sector, which is sort of my comfort zone, right? I think responsible corporations and companies do not wait for legislation when it comes to pushing a sort of sustainable agenda. There's a couple of examples that come to my mind when it comes to Uber. Typically, even though this commitment that I've mentioned in my presentation are about a year old in terms of those really bold ambitions and really setting very clear KPIs to these targets, we've actually started pushing sustainable option and sustainable programs in the Uber EMEA world well before that. So, for example, the very first city that benefited from Uber Green, which is a zero-emission product which you can add, which you can request on the Uber app, is actually from 2016 in Lisbon, Portugal. So this is an example. Another one is this clean air plan that I've mentioned that currently happens in London, which basically helps transfer money in the pockets of platform drivers so that they can switch to an EV. This program is already a few years old. I don't have the specific date from top of my mind. So all of this to say that responsible corporations, which I think Uber is a member of, will not wait for legislation. What is very clear is that positive or negative legislation, and I will qualify a little bit what I mean by that in a second, are definitely massively either helping or slowing down our effort. And we see that within Europe, in every country we're active in, but also globally. It is very much, and that's why I keep insisting on the fact that it's really a public-private partnership, because one doesn't go with the other. So it's almost a chicken and egg question. So to give you a couple of examples, in terms of very conducive type of policy that really help facilitate the efforts of the private sector, there's both the incentives, of course, which are that also benefited the private drivers. But what we would say in here is it's more about making sure that those incentives are tuned to really help decarbonization as opposed to helping with vehicle ownership. And that's really what we're trying to explain, is that, of course, we need this push from the government in order to help bridge that cost transition that I was talking about. Yeah, it's really important that we continue to have those incentives, but that they are more oriented towards high mileage driver, which, as I've mentioned, sort of displace CO2 in a much faster way. There's also a sort of negative aspect to it. So, for example, one example that I want to call out typically is what we call the return to garage rule in Germany. So Germany, you may or may not know that ride-hail vehicles between two rides, they need to return to the garage, and that's a legal requirement in order to check in. And that's a bit of an outdated regulation that is still in place today. And that obviously slows down the deployment of electric vehicles because it has an impact on range, it has an impact on efficiency, etc., etc. So to your point, I think good companies do not wait and push the effort because it's simply the right thing to do. What is very clear is that conducive policy, both carrot and stick, really help, and lack or outdated policies in certain parts of the world definitely slow down those efforts from private companies.
Thank you so much for that, Mathieu. Going back to a question a little bit more broader that you both mentioned at some point, and it's this fact of the industry lagging behind, but also some limitations to the way Europe operates because of the dependency from other countries. And I'm thinking about this question of strategic autonomy that all the members of the Commission have been talking about for ages. And when it comes to the electrification of transport in Europe, one of the questions is a question of batteries and raw materials that are needed for those batteries. And I wanted to come back maybe to Genevieve to think about how this has been impacting the strategy of more sustainable mobility, because Europe is somehow dependent on other countries on this. And what could they do to improve the industry within Europe to make sure that they respond to these needs that both Mathieu and Tom have been mentioning? How do you see this question of the dependence of Europe from those other countries around the world? You're muted, Genevieve, sorry.
Me. Okay, so as I mentioned quickly in my introductory remarks, they are good news as far as technology for batteries is concerned. The cost of making batteries is really going down much quicker than expected. But probably the most promising evolution is in fast chargers, because if you are able to have fast chargers, then you do not need to have big batteries. You can have small batteries and you can use less raw materials, less rare earths. So you can make small batteries if you are able to charge them more often, but much quicker. And this is the evolution which is taking place now. But unfortunately, these very precious innovations are not made in Europe. They are made elsewhere. They are made in Asia. And the first automotive companies that are providing these kind of charging devices are Korean. So we have in Europe to wake up and to be able to catch up on these innovations. It is going very quick. And in only a few years, it will no longer be more expensive for you and me to buy an electric car than to buy a combustion car. So the competition on this market is extremely strong, and Europe has to show its ability to catch up on innovation.
And how do you, the three of us, see the strategy of the EU in pushing for that innovation? And I think I want to have the reaction, particularly of Mathieu and Tom, on this one, because you come from the private sector. And we have seen a lot of criticism in some areas, particularly when it comes to technology and the digitalization of Europe. And some companies complain about the fact that there is not sufficient incentives indeed to see progress in the EU, that different legislations sometimes affect that progress. How do you see these, and how do you think it has impacted the development of the industry in this sense to become more sustainable? Maybe Tom, you were nodding strongly.
From our perspective, we think that in general, we are going in the right direction, but we should move faster. So incentivizing the use of collective transport, and in that kind also disincentivizing a bit using individual mobility, from our perspective, should have happened earlier and should happen at a faster pace right now. So where we think that the proposals set forward and the ideas first in Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy and now with the 55 package are going in the right direction. And for example, us, I mean, as a provider of bus services in almost all European countries, one could maybe think that we would not be in favor of putting additional charges on fossil fuels, whereas we are, because we believe that this is the right incentive to use collective transport. However, we should not forget that with that, we also have to provide then the alternative to the peoples that will be impacted by this measure. But we are ready to do it in long distance, and we hope that in local and urban context, I mean, the colleagues from Uber are here, there will also be solutions to offer the alternatives that are needed for this transition and to get to climate neutrality faster.
Thanks for that. Maybe Mathieu on this one, and also on the role that digitalization has played in making transport more sustainable, particularly because that Uber is a platform in itself. So how do you think this innovation is needed to push for a more sustainable transport system?
So to go back to one of the points that you made just before, I think that we have to recognize that a significant effort has been made in Europe versus other continents in terms of incentivizing access to vehicles, etc. I mean, of course, if you ask anybody in the private sector, they will tell you it's never enough, but genuinely, we have to recognize that a big effort has been made. I think one first point is that I think it's not so much about the size of the incentives, but it's about where they are placed. As I've mentioned, in terms of instead of sponsoring vehicle ownership, I really think we need to sort of drive what is really vehicle usage and therefore CO2 displacement. So that's one. Another thing that I want to mention is that what we are seeing is that negative incentives for ICE vehicles, so these incentives basically are also an extremely efficient way to drive EV transition. There's the Norway example, which is obviously in all the minds. But if you think about an example also like the zero emission zone in London, which basically creates a surcharge for all vehicles that do not comply to certain rules, etc. According to what we're seeing in our data, this type of legislation massively accelerate the EV uptake and without effectively spending more money, if anything, by getting more money from IC taxpayers. And I know it's not always very easy to pass through in the public opinion, and the Gilets jaunes, to Geneviève's point, is a typical reaction that sometimes can be very epidermic to these kind of changes. Nevertheless, I think this kind of, let's say, disincentive to IC can be really helpful.
Thanks for that. Geneviève, maybe a reaction on that one about the disincentivization of fossil fuel run vehicles, and this question of how there can be a reaction from the society towards that, which I think also links to the question of public transport and common transport alternatives. How do you see these in the coming years, and what do you feel is missing maybe in the EU strategy to make sure that these sort of systems of incentives and disincentives can actually work?
I think that in cities, you have alternatives to using a private car. And it is not just about the young generation, which is prone to just use a car and not possess a car. I think it is true for every generation. So we need to have cities that offer to their inhabitants real possibilities to go from their house to their work easily through public transportation and clean public transportation. The problem is more difficult to solve if you are out of cities. So in rural areas, you often do not have alternatives. And you will find in rural areas people who are so modest that they cannot afford to change their car. And especially right now, to buy a car, an electric car, which is more expensive. So I think that at national, regional level, there will be a need for helping these people change their car, and or, of course, offering them alternatives like collective travel alternative. So this is, I think that it's more in a non-urban area that this problem will be the most acute.
Thanks for that. I want to launch maybe a last question for each of you, and it's something that I do sometimes in this kind of panels, and which is giving you the chance to make a wish. So the idea is that we have here a discussion full of EU lawmakers, people who are in the EU affairs sector, and I was wondering from your perspective, in the case of Tom with Flitsbugs and over Mathieu and maybe Geneviève as yourself for the Institute, what is it for you missing in the EU strategy, being Fit for 55, being the sustainable mobility strategy, to make sure that you can yourself contribute to that change? What is it that you think is a challenge that you're facing and it's not addressed in those proposals, and you would like to see a proposal in that area? Maybe someone would like to start.
So maybe since we're having buses and trains, I'm allowed to do two wishes. So on the bus side, we have the feeling that they are often forgotten, even though they play an essential role for millions of Europeans to get from A to B, because in many regions it is actually not possible to offer train services. So for buses, actually the main ask and wish would be for them to being recognized as a sustainable alternative, and for the possibilities to find a way to build up the infrastructure and to deliver the vehicles that are needed to provide zero emission long distance bus services, because the technology is there, it just has to be picked up by the industry and by policymakers. And on the train side, there we just need a single European rail market with fair rules for market access across Europe, because we see a huge difference between the markets in Europe, between the countries. If we would have similar and fair rules, that already would help a lot, and we would see way more trains and way more people with them using trains across Europe.
Thank you so much for that. Those two wishes. First of all, let's recognize buses as part of the solution, and indeed, let's have common rules for railways so that we make sure that the private alternatives to the public sector companies can actually operate in different countries without having to go crazy about the different legislations. Thank you so much for that, Tom. Maybe Mathieu, what is your wish from the Uber perspective about how can the institutions help you to make transport more sustainable?
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. Yeah, it's a bit of an easy one because it's a point that I've already made a couple of times in this in this interaction. So clearly, if I could summarize it, I would say I wish for every euro of public money to displace as much CO2 as possible, right? And that what that means is effectively that all things being equal, I wish that public incentives and disincentives were really targeting high mileage drivers as opposed to a single vehicle ownership. And therefore that would help us not only displace more CO2, electrify our the driver fleet, the Uber driver fleet faster. But the thing is that because of this massive demand of charging that this electrified driver fleet would generate, this also has a flywheel, positive sort of virtuous cycle effect to the EVI infrastructure development, making sure that charge point operators have, stable revenues and predictable incomes, etc. So basically, by shifting a little bit the way this public money is used, we believe that can have an accelerator effect for the overall society.
Brilliant. We always like that that effect, that it ends up just not being good for one industry, but actually for the whole society. The common good is always our goal. Maybe Genevieve, from your perspective, having such an enormous experience in policy making, having seen all these many changes in the past few years, what do you think is missing in the EU strategy for a more sustainable transport?
We absolutely need to shift from unanimity to qualified majority to change our fiscal rules, because presently our fiscal system can be analyzed without any exaggeration in subsidizing the most polluting sectors. This is exactly the truth. So we are favoring fossil fuels through our energy taxation system, and we are trapped into it because of unanimity. So we need to change the rule and be able at European level to stop subsidizing fossil fuels and encourage renewable energy. And for that, we need to shift from unanimity to qualified majority for legislation about taxation.
Thank you so much for that. I am sure that would resonate among many, many people who are following us today. I would like to thank you all for this very interesting and very insightful discussion that we had today, and all our participants for being here today with us. But before you go, I'm going to give the floor back to Lauren for a last remark. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you to all our panelists for the interesting discussion. I think it's definitely been important for us to acknowledge that the transport sector is one of the biggest contributors to CO2 emissions, and we've heard about a lot of the challenges that surround that, whether it's the social reluctance about passing on costs to some of perhaps those who are not able to shoulder them, whether it's a lack of charging points for electric cars, also a couple of procedural difficulties relating to subsidies and perhaps how these legislations are voted. And we also heard about the high operating costs and the closed markets on the railways. But I thought that I took a lot of examples of kind of hope on how Europe can come to the forefront in offering solutions on these questions. We talked a bit about negative incentives, perhaps upping the kind of infrastructure that we have, whether it's faster chargers, whether it's manufacturers in Europe being open to this kind of new technology. We talked a bit about collective transport and lift sharing. And of course, we noted as well the point about opening up perhaps the railway markets for a bit more competition in that sense. But overall, I think we can be quite inspired. Genevieve also mentioned this new consumption culture among young people, so maybe we can bounce off that to embrace these new technologies and stay open to finding some solutions, which, as we heard, are coming often from the industry themselves. So it's good to get involved in that conversation. So I'd like to thank Genevieve, Mathieu and Tom for joining us, and Beatrice for the excellent moderation. We'll be back for our next on the agenda on the 14th of October, where we'll be looking at the question of European minimum wage. And the reason for that is because in 2 weeks' time, we'll be meeting on the 29th of September for our flagship conference, Science Not Fiction, which will be held at Auto World in Brussels. And we're looking at how science is now up to date, what the hardware sector is doing and how we can push innovation in Europe. So we look forward to joining you there, and the link for the event has just been shared in the chat if you need it. So thanks very much, everyone. Have an excellent afternoon and see you very soon.
Thank you all. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.